for the living. When I am dead, pray for me a little. Think of me sometimes, but not too much. It is not good for you to allow your thoughts to dwell too long on the dead. Think of me now and again as I was in life, at some moment that is pleasant to recall, but not for long. Leave me in peace, as I shall leave you too in peace. While you live, let your thoughts be with the living.
Welcome to Bay Area Psychology. One of the more endearing yet frustrating characteristics of American culture is our tendency to move forward optimistically and quickly. However, in our cultural restlessness, we have given short shrift to the necessary and healing nature of grief. To illustrate this point, I'll share a brief personal story. When my grandmother died, April 25th, in fact, some of you may have seen the show Aging Parents, which was dedicated to her. I mentioned that she was part of my nuclear family, and her loss has affected me deeply. The other day I was having a hard day, and a friend of mine, normally very compassionate, asked me what was bothering me. I shared that I was missing her, and he said, "Still? That was a while ago." I had passed my allotted grief time. After all, bereavement leave in many corporations is 3 days. To add to this, my doctor offered me an antidepressant. I found myself retreating to the safe haven of the Center for Living with Dying, where in that place, at least, grief is normalized. As anyone has ever experienced a significant loss can tell you, healing is an ongoing process and often takes years. We are fortunate to have with us two grief experts from the Center for Living with Dying to normalize this process for the rest of us. I want to welcome Janet Childs and Debbie Miranda. I'm delighted you could be here with us.
It's an honor to be here, Mary.
Okay.
Yes, thank you.
I wanted to note that, as I mentioned, we don't have a lot of tolerance in this culture for grieving. And I was wondering what it is about the two of you that you're willing to go forth bravely into an area most people run from. How are you able to work with grief work and retain your sanity?
Actually, I think for me, having been involved with the center since it started for almost 20 years now, I have found that actually working with grief in other people's lives has helped me to deal with and acknowledge and deal with and work through my own grief process. So it actually has given me that permission as well. We live in a society that is not very compassionate. As you said, we give a 3-day bereavement leave. We give people maybe 1 or 2 weeks to talk about that loved one, and then we expect you to move on with your life. And grief is very complicated, and grief is very intimate and very specific to that person that you have lost. And I think what happens to us in grief is that it brings up an overwhelming ocean wave of emotion. And I think many times we in American culture are very afraid of very powerful, deep emotions. And because I can't make you better in your grief, it's very difficult for me to deal with you. So when your pain starts to come up, and I can't fix it, and we live in a fix-it society.
Yes, we do.
We are forced then to either shut you down or to run away from it. And it's very interesting, I think, that what happens is one of my very first clients at the center was a young woman whose 4-year-old child was hit and killed by a car. And I'll never forget when I asked her, I said, "Dolores, what can I do to make it better?" And she looked me straight in my eyes and she said, "Janet, can you bring Mario back to me? Can you bring my son back?" And I had to look at her and say, "No, I can't. I can't make it better." And I had to acknowledge my own helplessness at that point. When I did, she looked at me with a lot of compassion in her eyes and said, "Janet, you can't make it better. Nobody can make it better.
That's right.
But you've given me more comfort by letting me talk about my son. And not only the death of him, which was very tragic, but also his 4 years of life. You let me share his life."
I think
that he had lived.
that is an important gift, because many of us have a very hard time sitting in the presence of other people's pain.
Yes.
And feeling helpless. I think helpless is an excellent
Yes.
word. How about you, Debbie? How do you manage to do this kind of work?
Well, I started off being a client at the Center for Living with Dying, and it helped me immensely. And I always thought in the back of my mind that if there can only be more of the staff at the center and the volunteers that can reach out and help people when they are in grief. And I thought, well, I can help with that. I can become a volunteer myself. And we've had some great training, and I've always been a pretty good listener, and that's pretty much what our training's all about, is listening and just being there for the person in grief.
Being there and not giving advice,
Right.
not fixing it, not saying, you know, well, if you do the following 3 things, it'll all be better.
Right.
Because I know that's one of the issues that comes up for people is, how long is this going to take?
It's a big one.
You know, it's, you know, okay, it's already been 3 months, you know, and I know, Debbie, you had shared with me a set of graphics or criteria when we look at how we can identify our grieving process. So I thought we'd take a look at our first one. The first 5 of our 10 stages of grief from Good Grief by Granger Westburn is a state of shock, emotional expression, depression and loneliness, physical symptoms of distress, and then panic. Let's talk a little bit about the state of shock. What does that feel like for people?
Even when the death is expected, Mary, there's still an unbelief. It still comes as a shock and a trauma, and we go through what is called a state of numbness. It is like being shot up with Novocaine at the dentist's office, and it's a natural protective measure that we as human beings have to enable us to survive those first few days, those first few weeks of grief, because we can't take in the full impact of the reality of the loss. It would be too overwhelming. So the shock kind of protects us. Unfortunately, in shock, oftentimes we look very good. So people say, you're so strong, you've handled this so well, you're coping so wonderfully. And actually, we're in shock. When the shock wears off is usually after the funeral, after the cards and letters have stopped coming, and that's when we often need the support and when the support has left us. It's that long desert of grief. But that shock is very necessary. And many times people say, well, I need to get this person out of denial.
Right.
But I'll tell you something, denial serves a purpose. It protects us from having to deal with the full reality. And we don't have to deal with it all at once. We can deal with it piece by piece, day by day, moment by moment.
When you talk about that being strong, it reminds me of that we still talk about Jacqueline Kennedy Onassa standing by the grave with the 2 boys and no expression, no tears, and somehow that becomes a role model for strength, that somehow retaining dignity and not letting people see how difficult this is seems to be a good thing. So I think it must be hard, Debbie. I'm sure, I know when you do grief groups, kind of giving people permission, you know, one of the next signs was emotional expression, to say, you know, not only is it okay to feel, but it's necessary.
Right, right.
And I know you have worked with grief with women who are in recovery from alcohol and drugs, I believe, as well. So they have a history of
a lot of loss.
Tremendous amount of loss.
Yes, they have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
People often won't process right away, won't they? I mean, you talk about denial. What happens can you stay in shock 10 years or 5 years? Or what is that about, where somebody doesn't deal with it at all and then 5 years later has another loss and it hits them? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And one of the things that happens is we can literally be stopped in our grief, either by ourselves and our own judgments about grief or by other people saying that we need to stop talking about it and move on. So anywhere along that grief journey, if we think of it as a road, as a journey that we walk, we can get stopped or stuck. And normally what happens is people will bring it up, will try to deal with it, but people will shut them down. So what happens is a present loss will trigger any past unresolved loss we've had. Because grief knows no time. It doesn't matter how long ago that grief occurred. If we never had the opportunity to heal it, it's like it happened yesterday. And we grieve as deeply as we bond. You know, you were very beautiful, Mary, in sharing about your grandmother. We have very special relationships with our grandmothers, for example, very different than those we have with our parents. And our depth of our grief is dependent upon the depth that we bond and connect with that person. And so we have a tendency to judge or minimize our grief and do comparison grief shopping.
That's right.
You know, it's like, my pain isn't nearly as bad as yours because it was my grandmother, it was your mother, or whatever comparison
Right.
we make. And our grief is dependent upon the depth of our love. And so we need to honor that. And one of the things that happens is that we can work with healing the grief even 10, 20, 30 years later. I worked with a woman whose husband committed suicide 33 years before she came to the center for support. And what she needed was she needed to have a funeral for her husband. Back in those days, because of the way he died, there was such a stigma against suicide, she had no memorial service. And so 33 years later, she had a service for him and was able to heal that grief.
That is wonderful. I'm glad that people have a place they can go and get that information. It's kind of like, it reminds me also, one of the symptoms that was listed there was physical. Physical symptoms that even if you say we can get blocked in our grief by the people saying, I don't want you to talk about it, or it's time for you to move on, I don't think our bodies are able to do that, are they? What kind of physical symptoms have you seen, Debbie?
In my group that I have, when they're really going through the sobbing and everything, I'll ask them where their pain is, and a lot of them, their heart hurts, or their throat hurts because they've been forced to shove it back down, and it just sits there.
Okay.
Yes.
So we can have, some of the reading I did indicated we could have also symptoms like we're not able to sleep, maybe gastrointestinal problems, headaches, sort of like our body will speak for us, backaches, even when we're not verbalizing it. And I would imagine that it's possible, if I'm not consciously trying to think about it, I may be having these physical symptoms and attributing them to all sorts of other things, like, gee, work has been really stressful lately. Yeah, so it's possible, even though we've suffered the loss, to forget ourselves. I mean, not just other people, but for us to forget.
Exactly. And sometimes it's hard to deal with the pain. And what we don't express, like you said, emotionally or verbally, does come out in our body. And the body is the container of our pain and our joy. So the body never lies. Whenever you really want to know how you feel, just as Debbie does with her groups, when she asks them, where is the pain, it helps them to make it specific, to really get down to what does it really feel like, and where do you feel it, and what is the sensation? Is it a tightness in your chest? Is it a churning in your stomach? Is it a closing of your throat? Is it tears that are sometimes just behind the eyes? Is it aching, behind the neck from holding in the pain, and also sometimes the anger we have?
I'm going to need to interrupt you just a moment. We will come back to that because it's time for our break. When we return, we'll talk more about anger, and we'll also have a musical perspective from Janet. Stay tuned and see you in a minute.